Hello everyone, this is the first of two lectures I'm going to be giving on Karl Marx. Two lectures because he says so much about so many things and he's been so influential. Marx, along with his lifelong friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels, has probably influenced the 20th century more than any other single thinker. His ideas have generated a vast amount of academic literature. And when he isolated the working class as the bearer of the future society, i.e. the communist society that would develop dialectically out of the contradictions of the capitalist era, when he identified the working class as the leading element in this historical progression, this set off workers' movements and political parties all over the world dedicated to the task of the overthrow of capitalism. And indeed, numerous revolutions have occurred and states have been created claiming, rightly or wrongly, to have been based on Marx's ideas, Soviet Union, China, and so forth. One could question whether these countries were ever in line with what Marx had in his head as to what a communist society would be like, but nonetheless, one can claim, I think, that these countries did base their general structure around the thinking and ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And Marx, when I talk about Marx, we must also consider that Engels was an important element in Marx coming to his ideas. But I think Marx, as Engels once remarked, Marx was the genius. He said, I was merely talented. So when I talk about Marx, well, I will be talking about Marx, but bear in mind that Engels had some input into this to a lesser extent. Now, Marx is difficult to summarize, but he was, we know, heavily influenced by George William Friedrich Hegel. And today we might think of Marx perhaps as a philosopher. We can certainly see him as a sociologist. We can call him a historian, a political scientist, a political activist, a writer, an economist. He was what we call a polymath, as genius people often are. And I don't think the word genius really is misplaced here when talking about Marx. Well, he was certainly all of those things. And like Hegel, he saw that these seemingly separate areas of human activity and human understanding, he saw that these were linked together into something larger, into something whole. So fragmentary areas, and particularly the fragmentary areas, sociology, economics, political science, and so forth, the way these things are laid out as disciplines and taught in universities, we get to the idea that perhaps they are separate lines of inquiry with no relation between. Well, actually, Marx illustrates to us the connections, and he puts things together to build the bigger picture in very Hegelian tradition, but fundamentally in a different way from that done by Hegel that we looked at before. So that's something we can say that is pressing in economics, is also pressing in politics, and it's also pressing in society, only in different ways. And so for Marx, it would be a great mistake to think that we can study something like sociology in isolation of the other pressures in the other subject areas, because they are fundamentally linked together. It's just that as a study, and if we come to university, we'd have to spend the rest of our lives in university probably to study all the separate disciplinary areas in order to bring them all together into the big picture. But of course, this is the very thing that Marx does, and this is, to my mind, why he probably qualifies for the mantle of genius. Now, Marx was born, and by the way, I've uploaded the PowerPoint slideshow to you, and we're on slide 1. Marx was born in Trier in the German Rhineland in 1818. He was the son of a Jewish lawyer, and Marx's parents were what you would now call, I suppose, lower middle class, or what Marx in his time would go on to describe as petty bourgeoisie. Now, Marx was sent to the University of Berlin, where he graduated with a doctorate in ancient Greek philosophy and the classics in 1841. At university, Marx became a member of a group of radicals known as the Young Hegelians. Hegel was an advocate of the French Revolution, as we know. He supported it, he welcomed it as an important historical development. Hegel, of course, was himself radical in his early life. However, Hegel, as he got older, as is very often the case with people, they gradually become a little bit more moderate. And in actual fact, Hegel, according to Marx, became somewhat reactionary and conservative in his old age. And he, as was mentioned, I think last week, that Hegel even indicated towards the end of his life that the aristocratic, militaristic, and largely undemocratic state of Prussia at that time was nearing the end of history, as though human development was almost complete as manifested in the Prussian state, which to Marx was absolutely absurd. And this was a big disappointment to him and his more left-wing and radical followers, people like Marx, and what became known as the Young Hegelians. The Young Hegelians were this university group of intellectuals that Marx socialized with. They began to interpret Hegel in leftist terms, and some Hegelians actually became more rightist, and some became more leftist. The rightists emphasized in Hegel his ideas on the state, his ideas on the mystical nature of national identity, and sort of explored Hegel in that direction. The leftists seized on Hegel's dialectical radicalism as progression through resistance, through contradiction and criticism and so forth. That other aspect of Hegel, that other important aspect of Hegel's thinking, the dialectical, confrontational, and the dialectical key to history and progression. So the leftist Young Hegelians tended to secularize the dialectical process. Hegel, of course, saw human society as almost being pulled through history by God, who was waiting at the teleological point for humanity's arrival. Some all-embracing conclusion to human development. So, in other words, human history really, though it was made by human beings, its destiny was God, and unity with the absolute spirit of God. And so, in a sense, this was all God's plan, as though God is the real architect and orchestrator of this entire process, even though perhaps we don't realize it. So the end of history occurs when humans become fully conscious of God, and then we have made God's rationality, God's consciousness on Earth real. So then, of course, we've made planet Earth and the people that live on it, the societies and the structures and everything else that we've created it exactly the way that God would have designed it. And so Hegel sees God as the orchestrator on the outside, as it were, of human society, sort of pulling human society through history to this final conclusion point. But the leftist Young Hegelians, like Marx, tended to increasingly see the absolute or the teleological end of history as simply the completion of humanity itself. Human society has its own end. It's not really This is not really corresponding to an end design from something outside of society itself. Therefore, the source of change and development is contained within society and nowhere else. So now we've got the dialectic working within society itself, and this idea that somehow it's moving towards some design which is outside of society was rejected by the young Hegelians, the leftist young Hegelians. At this time, the young Hegelians, and this is, I think, an important point to make, the young Hegelians in general remain, for the most part, epistemologically idealist, as Hegel himself was. So, it's this idea of making our rationality real. What is real is rational, and what is rational is real. Now, it took Marx. Marx had this sort of feeling in his water, as it were, that there was something wrong about what Hegel was saying. But such was the grip of Hegel on the young Hegelians, and even with an intellect of Marx's caliber, the grip of Hegel was very strong, and it took Marx some time to break free of the grip of Hegel on his thinking. Now, Marx was certainly critical of the Prussian government to begin with. Firstly, the Prussian government, and don't forget, this is the Prussian government is really for Hegel reaching some sort of completion point. But when you for Marx, when you actually look at the detail, this was a really absurd and ridiculous claim. For a start off, here was Marx, who graduated as a doctor of philosophy, but he was excluded from working in public universities because he was Jewish. So the fact that he was Jewish prevented Marx from pursuing a career as a professional philosopher at university. I got the feeling that Marx would never have been entirely happy doing that anyway, as a young man, probably later like Hegel, but as a young man I don't think he would have been entirely satisfied with it. But the fact that he had to take off in a different direction with his career was partly determined by this anti-Jewish prejudice that the Prussian state of the time exhibited. And of course, Marx thought it was very strange that a great man like Hegel, whom he admired a great deal, could think that Prussia was nearing the end of history. This seemed, as I say, to Marx to be an absolutely absurd notion. But anyway, what was Marx to do? Well, he had to earn a living, and so he went on to take up journalism, and he became a radical critic of the time, what Hegel called, of course, the zeitgeist. This period of time, Marx becomes very much engaged with the zeitgeist through his journalistic activity. And he consistently criticized those with power in society, and in some ways this led Marx to be something of an outcast. He was the perennial and eternal critic, and all we could seem to get out of Marx was criticism and never flattery. And of course this makes enemies, doesn't it? It rattles people's cages, and they become upset with people like Marx. Because Marx doesn't appear to have anything good to say. And if you look at Marx's writings throughout his career, I mean, he's pretty damning in his criticism towards some people, and he doesn't seem to care who he upsets. And he says some perhaps quite nasty things at times about people who otherwise influenced him. But that's just, one of his personality traits. I imagine he was a great guy to be around, but at times he would have been a difficult person, I think it's fair to say. But anyway, so he didn't exactly ingratiate himself and make himself popular, and this led him to be something of an outcast, and he would soon find himself actually and his family chased around Europe by various governments. And eventually he was to settle in London in 1849, where his criticisms of governments in France and in Germany and in Prussia and so forth was eagerly welcomed. The British were quite happy to hear anyone contradicting and criticising their European neighbours, which is perhaps a British national sport, which is, of course, being conducted now with with what's happened with Brexit and so forth, this kind of quiet hostility to continental Europe. And of course, Marx, therefore, he didn't really confront the British establishment in this way, and brought really to London criticisms that he was making of continental European countries and their governments and so forth. Now, it's here that Marx sets out his ideas in London. He sets out his ideas in writing that would in time become the basis of what we call historical materialism. Historical materialism. The leader of the Russian Revolution in 1917 was a gentleman called Vladimir Ilyich, otherwise known as Lenin. Now, he once wrote that Marxism is a synthesis of German philosophy, English political economy, and French socialism. And we can find him saying this in a pamphlet that he wrote called The Three Sources and Three Component Parts of Marxism, which he put together in 1913. So Marxism's got these three components. And when we talk about Marxism, we're talking really about historical materialism. We'll come to that in a minute. But it's got, for Lenin, three distinctive components. And as I said at the beginning, there are different processes going on in the different components, but they all culminate in a contribution to something much larger. And Lenin isolated German philosophy, English political economy, and French socialism as the three key component parts of Marxism. So when I'm lecturing, I think that Lenin's given us a good way of sort of an entry point into historical materialism, because using these three components, we can analyze them separately in order to come to an understanding of historical materialism. So today we'll deal with the first component, philosophy, German philosophy, that is. We will see Marx adapting Hegel's historical method to and giving it a materialistic expression. And yes, Marx is, and he was to become, a materialist. But he also uses Hegel's method to explain historical change. So what we call Marxism is better understood as historical materialism. The materialism bit was really a rejection of Hegel. The historical bit in historical materialism was really the adaptation of the materialist method to Hegel's dialectical ideas. If you turn to PowerPoint number 2, well, Marx was, he had something of what we would call today a social conscience. He was from a young age a social critic, but he started his social criticism, one must realize, from a Hegelian standpoint, and he gradually pulled away from Hegel. So there was something, the vestiges of Hegel's idealism in Marxist thinking for some time, certainly during the 1840s and 50s. And yet Hegel seemed to, as important as Hegel was, he seemed to have lost some of the critical bite that Hegel himself thought was so important in human development. And so Marx is emphasizing this criticism, the importance of criticism, and the historical role of criticism. And to Marx, this loss of radicalism, really, in Hegel and his followers, was due to there being something wrong, in fact, with Hegel's method. So we talk of Geist, spirits, temporary zeitgeist, the temporary spirit, and the absolute Geist. To Marx, Hegel was far too dependent on mysticism and metaphysics. What are ghosts? What are these ghosts that are supposed to be, all influential in pushing human history through this process? And for Marx, this is the problem with the idealistic method. This idea that it's purely the human imagination, as it were, that reality is grounded in. And what Marx does is he looks for what he believed is a truer account of history and social reality. Social reality, the way that people lived, is actually more important for Marx than perhaps the way that they thought. And so the way that they lived is grounded really in a material reality. So Marx found part of his solution to the problem that he perceived in Hegel's method in philosophical materialism. He found part of the solution here. Now, of course, a materialist sees the reality of our lives as really about our material existence, our material needs. Humans themselves, we are made of material substances. I'm a material thing, the same as you are. And we have material needs in order to keep our body and soul together, to stay alive. And these are the concrete realities which order people's lives. The necessity to keep to stay alive and to survive. And this is the nature of human reality. This is the reality that confronts our lives. We need food, we need water, we need shelter. We wouldn't last very long without shelter. We wouldn't last very long without food, maybe a few weeks. We wouldn't last more than a few days without water. And so we've got material needs. And it's these material needs really that dictate to us the manner of our living. But Marx found that the existing materialistic theories of society and politics were rather static. There was no explanation of history and change. Indeed, the materialistic thinkers like people like Hobbes and Locke that we know, although they were good for their time and actually Marx compliments both for the contributions they made to our understanding of human reality. But although they were good for their time, for Marx they were now, by the middle of the 19th century, ultimately disappointing. Now, Marx's German contemporary was a gentleman called Ludwig Feuerbach, and he was a materialistic thinker, and Marx draws a lot from Feuerbach. Much of his fundamental criticism of Hegel's idealism he gets from Feuerbach to start with. Now, so what did Feuerbach say? Well, let's have a look. He argued that Hegel had simply turned a human characteristic, the faculty of thinking, into the ruling principle of reality. Instead of seeing humans as part of the material world, Hegel had turned all of history into mere reflections of the logic of the human mind. Well, Hegel himself would admit to that, of course. But what he'd done for Feuerbach was that Feuerbach assumed was that Hegel had turned us into ghosts and spirits. Feuerbach says this. He turned us into ghosts and spirits. In other words, he disembodied us. He took us out of our bodies and made spirits out of us. And of course, then we were in search of some eternal ghost, some absolute spirit in which to unify the spirit that has been disembodied from us. So we become, for Feuerbach, disembodied, dematerialized. And so we're now entering into a sort of a ghost-like existence, which has no connection to our material reality and the material reality of our lives, and so forth. So Hegel's not interested in the banal ideas like how do we stay alive, what work do we do, how do we produce things, what do we eat and drink, and all our sort of material needs. Hegel's not interested in that. Those are lower order realities. The ultimate reality, of course, is this spirit that he identifies within us. It's the highest manifestation of our aliveness, which is chasing after some sort of absolute spirit through history. Well, Feuerbach's not buying into any of this argument. So Hegel treats humans as though they had no necessary material existence. But Feuerbach turns this round. Our physical being, says Feuerbach, must come before our thinking. For there to be a thought, argues Feuerbach, there first needs to be a thinker. So you have to have a thinker before you can think something. And so how do we have and sustain a thinker? Well, the thinker has to have a material a reality, a material presence. There can't be an abstract thought. A thought is thought by someone who's got a material existence. So first, of course, is our material existence, and then we've got our thought. So Hegel would say it's the other way around. We've got our thought, and then we've got our material instinct, our material reality, which we set up on the basis of the way that we're thinking. Well, Feuerbach says, wait a minute, you can't think, and you won't be able to think unless you're alive, unless you've got a material existence. Now, of course, you might say, well, this seems obvious, but Hegel believed that human history was an unfolding story, to remind you, of the attempt to unify our thinking with that of God. So there exists a background logic to history that is pure thought, pure in that it is not based on human thought. But who in that case is doing the thinking? Hegel's answer is that ultimate reality is the product of God's thinking. God's thinking. So humans through history are simply gaining ever greater insights into the thinking of God. That's what's going on for Hegel. So God is somehow the ultimate driver of human history from beginning to end. But how about Feuerbach sees that without God, Hegel's system simply can't work. It just doesn't seem to stand up. Without God, it's God dependent. So he attacks, really. He then begins to think about this concept of God. And really, Feuerbach would be more famous to us today, though we know, of course, that whenever we think of Feuerbach, we think of his influence on Marx. But as a freestanding thinker, Feuerbach is probably today best remembered for his attack on religion. So he's got this idea that without God, Hegel's philosophical system would fall apart, and so he sees that this is the weak point, and he goes on the attack on the concept, at least Hegel's concept of God. So he begins to question the whole notion of religious belief, and Feuerbach argues that humans give to this God all their best features. And what he suggests is that we created God in the first place, and once having created this God, we give to God all our best features, all our best human features. God is kind. God is love. God is compassionate. God is wise. God is all-seeing, and God is forgiving, etc., etc. But Feuerbach says that these things are actually human characteristics, and the best human characteristics. So what we've done is we've created a God with the best ideas that we have of ourselves. Our finest characteristics, our God is made of our finest, our human finest characteristics. And how is it possible, he says, to do otherwise? Where would we get the measure of what God is without this? What would be our understanding of God without this ability to extrapolate onto God our best features, not necessarily God's best features, because we don't know what God is. We can't see God. We can't measure what the best features of God are. And so it's religion and our conception of God must be a contrivance, a construction, which we put together of our best human characteristics. So when we worship God, thinks Feuerbach, and I think you have to say that Feuerbach's got some interesting ideas here. When you worship God, you're actually worshiping yourself. And this was an idea picked up by the sociologist Emil Durkheim later on, that actually with religion, society's worshipping itself. That's what it's doing. So when we worship God, we're really worshipping ourselves. This is an interesting idea. So the next step in our own self-estrangement or alienation, self-estrangement is what Hegel called it, our self-alienation. The next step in this process, the problem with religion, is to think of our human characteristics as existing outside of us. And that's what we've done. So we're making our societies better, and we are introducing more of what we conceive to be God's features. According to Hegel, we're introducing, as we go through history, more and more of the features that we attribute to God. But of course, for Feuerbach, we created God in the first place. And so we are, in a sense, if anything, winning back the features that we already gave away to God. But Feuerbach, therefore, he comes to the opposite of Hegel in thinking that these characteristics are outside of us and externalized. The pursuit of God through religion actually makes us less human, not more human. This is what Feuerbach is saying. The opposite of what Hegel's saying. So we give God all our best features and then set about in history to imagine we are regaining them. So we are therefore, if we are alienated and if we are self-estranged, if we are incomplete as humans and there's a portion of our humanity missing from us, it's our fault, because we are really the cause of our own alienation by giving to God in the first place all our best features, for which we through history are trying to claim back. Feuerbach must have been quite a clever guy to have been able to take on Hegel in this way, because Hegel was really dominant in intellectual circles throughout the early 19th century. So Marx applauds Feuerbach's ideas, certainly that humans are both the cause and the solution of their own misery. I think Marx certainly adopts that idea, and I think we can find it originally in Feuerbach's criticism of religion. So we end up appealing to God for help when we ought to be applying ourselves as humans to the problems of the world that we have made. So if we've made it, then we've also got the key to improving it. So the impact on Marx here can't really be overstated. Feuerbach argues that reality is actually the fact of our material existence, the material creations we are. Our being, therefore, must come before our thinking. We cannot exist in thought alone. And to remind ourselves, idealists argue that the outer physical world is mind dependent. Without a mind to know it, of course, for Feuerbach, there is no world to know. Now, by the early 1840s, Marx was a confirmed materialist and indeed a revolutionary. Feuerbach was a revolutionary too, but his criticisms of Hegel had caused him to perhaps overlook Hegel's potential. We use this expression in English, to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So you bath the baby, and when you go to throw the dirty water away, you throw the baby out at the same time. And maybe that's what Feuerbach did with Hegel. There was still in Hegel, for Marx, there was still something very useful and very insightful in Hegel. Marx actually says of Feuerbach, he says, and I quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world." I'll start again. "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it," unquote. And Marx says that in this is a passage from a work that he produced early in his career called "The Thesis on Feuerbach." So the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. So this is what I meant earlier about the static nature of materialistic thinking at that time. Feuerbach's not exactly telling us how change comes about. I mean, he certainly lays into Hegel's theory of historical change, but he doesn't really present us with an alternative. So the question, when Marx says the point is to change it, the question becomes, how do we change the world? And Marx actually here goes back to Hegel for the answer, specifically the dialectical theory of history. Now, what has happened in Marx is that Feuerbach gives him a way back to Hegel that is devoid of all idealism and mysticism. So in a way, Feuerbach has cleared the path for Marx to go back to Hegel and look again at him. And Marx like Feuerbach, actually becomes thoroughly humanistic. This idea that the dialectic is a purely a product of human development. There is no external correspondence to some absolute development. Development is self-contained within society itself without any reference to anything outside of itself. What Marx would later go on to describe as the ensemble of social relations. So this is the determinant of the dialectical process, society itself. So God's out of the picture. So with that, of course, humans possess the key to unlock history for themselves. And in this sense, thinking about God was not a dynamic cause drawing us forward through history, and thinking about how we can improve our societies and so forth with reference to God. Actually, God, if we turn this round now and say that we've given our best features to God, and we're therefore trying and struggling through history to claim them back, this is actually a symptom now of our alienation. So religion for Feuerbach, and increasingly for Marx, religion is depicted as a symptom of life, not the cause of life. So in a sense, where we need religion somehow to fill in this problem of our own alienation. So when we come to discuss alienation, it's not the fact that human beings and human societies are alienated from God, as Hegel would see it. We're self-alienated. We've created God. This is a social manufacture, and we now depict ourselves as alienated from God. But this is actually more an alienation which stems from our own social processes, and those things are obviously the cause, therefore, of our own alienation, the social processes themselves. So the phenomenon of religion actually expresses, for Marx, the pain that humans feel from this alienation. This alienation is socially manufactured. And we can hear echoes of Rousseau in that idea, I'm sure. Now, Marx writes in a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which he wrote in 1843, he says, Marx, and I quote, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." So there we have it. In that phrase, it's a sort of a religion is a sort of a painkiller, and it becomes a focal point as a symptom as a condition of our alienation. We've deflected our attention towards some external force when the causes of our own suffering are made by us. So we suffer because we have given away not only our best features to God, but also the sense that our lives are ultimately in our control. So religion simply compensates for this sense of loss that we've got. Now, if you turn to PowerPoint number 3, please. Now, to Hegel, all of history was really a socially combined philosophical inquiry into the nature of reality. Philosophy being the highest form of socialized understanding, the zeitgeist at a particular time. The philosophers were at the apex of defining the zeitgeist. So this developmental process that Hegel identifies leads humans forward as consciousness of reality was gradually revealed step by step. And as reality reveals itself to the mind, so we make this rationality real in the physical world. This is classical Hegelian. And we make our world based on our thinking about it. But as we shall see, Marx turns this round, but by applying Hegel himself. So he turns Hegel upside down. For Hegel, the process of human evolution is brought about dialectically. We know dialectics involve the presentation of a theme, a theory, a thesis, which becomes a practice. This is then subjected to a contradiction from within itself. Out of this contradiction, something new is created, which in turn will become confronted by a further contradiction from within itself again, and so on and so on. So the dialectical method has two basic assumptions. All things human embody its own contradiction. This contradiction, secondly, is the cause of change. Now, Hegel then goes a step further. Change is based on a process of the transformation of quantity into quality. Quantity always produces a given qualitative effect. So, for example, when we're talking about the transformation of quantity into quality, for example, if we lower the temperature of water, nothing happens until we reach 0 degrees centigrade. Then it becomes ice. So when we heat the ice, it turns back into water again. Then nothing happens until we reach 100 degrees centigrade and the water turns to gas. So the change in the quantity of the temperature leads to changes in the quality of the thing: ice, water, steam. So we've got something of a causal relationship here, haven't we? The pressure of the contradiction is therefore heat in this example, and the qualitative change, ice, water, steam, would be society itself. So the quantity changes the quality. Now, for Marx, of course, the quantity here would be our material processes in society. I'll come to that in a minute. And the quality, the changes in quality would be in a reference to our society. So the quantity, the cause-effect relationship here is our material existence and how we produce. I'll come on to this in a minute. That's what we would depict as being the quantity, using Hegel's idea of transformation of quantity into quality. The quality in this case would be human society, and the quantity which brings about these fundamental qualitative changes would be the quantity, which in this case is our economic activity. Now, Hegel, of course, argues that beneath this apparent opposition of quantity and quality, there is an underlying unity. Neither quantity nor quality embodies reality in itself. So there are two aspects to reality, but of course they are fused together into this dialectical oneness. So the truth lies in the combined interaction of quality and quantity together as they combine to produce change or movement over time. But what is the source of dispute between Hegel and Marx here, of course, is this ultimate source. What is the source of this quantitative pressure? And of course, for Hegel, the source is God, as I said to you before. Now, where Marx differs fundamentally is that both quantitative pressure and qualitative change is explainable within society itself, as I said before. In other words, both cause and effect exist in society. The dialectical process is totally humanized. Society itself is a unity, but it's a unity of opposites made up of classes, as we shall see. Now, Marx therefore takes Hegel and his method, but he applies it differently. The dialectical process involves real living people going about their daily lives. And Marx sets out his ideas on society here, and this struggle that he's got with Hegel to rid himself of this idealism. I think this culminates really the final settling of accounts with Hegel, as it were, is accomplished in a book that Marx wrote with Engels in 1846, a book that wasn't actually published until the 1930s, called The German Ideology. And probably the German ideology is our best example of Marx's theory of history. And what Marx claims to have done is to have turned Hegel upside down. He says in Hegel he found a man standing on his head. So what he's done is to stand Hegel on his feet. I set him again on his feet, says Marx. What is lacking in Hegel, what we've seen Marx criticize Hegel for, was this sort of mysticism, this creation of these disembodied ghosts, this dehumanization process. So what's lacking in Hegel, for Marx, is this notion of real, sensuous, breathing, eating, functioning human beings. That's what's missing. So for Marx, philosophy and consciousness in general could not be abstracted from society in this way. So contrary to Hegel, it's not real living humankind it is real living humankind that drives history, not abstract ideas produced by philosophers or anyone else. It's again this human juggernaut, and our living, sensuous, breathing people going about their daily lives who are somehow developing history. So the human mass actually makes reality every day. And what does it do every day? Well, it goes to work. Its actions, its primary actions in attempting to exist and to sustain itself, its primary actions are economic. So the human mass makes reality every day in its work and the things that it produces and in the way that it produces. This is what defines life. And this goes on regardless of what we think about it. We can think in any kind of abstract way, perhaps, but this is the reality of our lives for Marx. So it's our way of life that determines our thinking, it determines our consciousness, not the other way around. So Hegel would say, of course, it's our consciousness that determines our way of life. Marx has turned this round. It's our way of life that determines our consciousness. The key idea here is that our daily activities, for the most part, concern staying alive, our means of subsistence. That's the ultimate reality. And thought is secondary to that process. So in this sense, being and thinking become united in our material production process. It's our material production that drives societal change. Humans produce and reproduce their material needs. And this is what work is all about. Society is nothing other than a collectivized process for producing things that are necessary for our physical survival. You could say that society is nothing more than an elaborate economic arrangement in this regard. But if this is so, well, we've still got the mystery of understanding what our thinking is all about. But what Marx sees is this correlation between historical change and changes in our thinking. He sees that there's a correlation, and so Hegel is right, our thinking does change, but it's not changes in thinking that drives history forward. Our changes in thinking are actually a secondary byproduct of the changes that we make that occur through a different process. So Marx is arguing that society does change, yes, but as it changes, so too do our beliefs, our desires, our knowledge, our abilities, the way that we think about the world, our philosophy, our science, and in short, our ideological patterns. These things are not the drivers of change, but actually the secondary effects of change. But of course, Marx also recognizes that this ideological component has a function in the sense that it combines with our material production and it helps us understand what living is all about. But fundamentally, to understand how people think, we have to really look at their life conditions. And this is the problem with Hegel's notion of ideas. He simply abstracted ideas from society and its productive activities. And this is the most important activity that we have as social beings, our productive activity. It's what takes up the majority of our lives. I remember a guy that I worked with years ago going to work, and we laughed because he certainly made me laugh when he was just married. And he said, I spend more time with you than I do with my wife. Well, of course he does, because he's working with me, and work takes up so much of our lives. It becomes the centerpiece of our activity. Um, and this idea then that we can abstract our ideas from our social existence is for Marx quite wrong. So it's our society itself which directly conditions the way that we think. And so Marx really sees it to be, for the most part, impossible to sort of think outside of the social box, as it were. So, for example, when we think of human nature here, what we really mean is actually social nature, since our self-understanding is caught up in our social world. So for Marx, at any stage in history, our thinking, our consciousness in general, is attuned to our productive realities, our material productive realities. Marx argues that our ideas are geared to production, and this helps explain and thus legitimize production to us as we live through that particular moment. So in other words, our ideology, as it were, our consciousness, is actually necessary to explain, however rudimentarily or however contradictorily, it explains to us our material existence. So each period in history, and if you look into the German ideology, there are different periods in which we pass through. But in each period of history, we produce in different ways our material subsistence, but we also produce different ways in which society explains itself. So our own mode of production, as Marx put it, produces its own mode of consciousness connected to it. So if we look at something from the past, like an idea that we had in our minds, the divine right of kings, for example, that Hobbes did so much to weaken, was really the idea of the feudal ruling class of the time, the divine right of kings, which obviously sought to stabilize society. But what it was actually doing was, of course, stabilizing the social relations of the feudal period, and such ideology, of course, would be serving the dominant class in that relationship. And we might be able to see something perhaps similar in the Lockean principle of property accumulation. Freedom and toleration was therefore geared to the transition from feudalism to capitalism. So we see perhaps Locke as an intermediary figure when he was weakening the grip of aristocratic ideology on us and conditioning us perhaps to new economic practices in line with the introduction of industrial capitalism in time. So these processes would have been going on in society, which is what conditioned these ideological standpoints that were produced by great philosophers like Hobbes and Locke. So new production necessitates the creation of new ideas, and these new ideas, of course, do infuse our institutions. Our institutions are modified to keep pace with the social movement. But this is not the driving force in itself. The driving force of all this, as is made clear in the German ideology, is the economic change process, the process of economic life and the changes therein. So to Hegel, new ways of looking at the world create material changes in the world. What the world is reflects what we think, but Marx turns this upside down. What we think is actually a reflection of the material world. So we gain a sense of ourselves and the meaning of our lives through our activities. And chief among these activities, of course, is our economic activity, or more specifically, our labor process. And so, to Marx, philosophy was really just an expression and reflection of real life practices already at work. And in this way, of course, philosophy does not lead history. Philosophy follows the lead of material existence and gives expression to it. And a Marxist would say excuses the exploitative arrangements in that society at that particular time. So John Locke's ideas were only really a philosophical expression of changing economic processes at that time. And Locke therefore articulated the need for philosophical change. So Locke's ideas were really an amendment to our thinking in line with changes, economic changes, underlying economic changes that were going on at that time. And so Locke is in effect sort of amending our thought and to bring it in line and to bring it into tune with changes in our economic behavior. But the point that I need to hammer home is that the drive for change originated in the life practices of this society, this material life practices of society. So when we're talking about Locke, Locke's thought was merely a product, really. Then, in this sense, the thinking was already Locke's thinking is already suggested in the way that society was beginning to shape up and the practices and so forth. Locke articulates things that are already going on in material life. Now, if you turn to PowerPoint number 4. We call Marx's system historical materialism, as I say. It's materialistic because the determining factors of society are given to be the way humans produce and reproduce their material existence. It's historical because production is constantly evolving and changing over time. And so is society. So history is really only marked by changes in production and the changes in the social formations, which also produce changes of a secondary nature in our thinking, in our consciousness. So for Marx, history is really the story of changes in human production. As humans, we combine in society because creating the means for our survival can't be done alone. It's a team effort. We have no real choice in this matter. So our membership of society is given to be involuntary. We can't survive alone. And this becomes particularly true as society evolves and becomes more complex. This would be Marx's explanation for society. Society becomes organized around the struggle with and against nature, or human activity and acquired knowledge is grounded in the struggle with and against nature. So what Marx is arguing is that history reveals that human society came into existence in order to produce, and that's his conception of the foundation of society. It's an economic conception, and this requires us to win things from nature necessary for our survival. But this also requires that humans engage with one another too. This process of extracting from nature requires humans to engage with one another. So human society is not just struggling with nature, it's struggling with itself also, from within itself. And this is what was referred to earlier. Society is a unity, but it's a unity of distincts. Society is fractured by class. It looks like a unity, but it's actually fractured by class. So how does Marx really arrive at this idea? Well, we need to trace this. Firstly, we engage with nature to produce. But to do this, we create definite social relations. And it's this combination of the conversion of nature by various techniques and methods and the social relations that form around them that Marx calls the mode of production, or you see it read sometimes the means of production. You will see it written, I should say, sometimes as the means of production. So the mode of production in any age has two components. Firstly, as we confront nature, we find strategies to extract what we need from it. We begin by producing tools and equipment to help us produce. and produce more efficiently and effectively. And we learn from our experience as we reflect back on the things that we're doing. We begin to find better ways of exploiting nature. We find new technologies that improve on the previous. For example, the power of the horse gives way to the power of water to drive water wheels, which can be connected to rudimentary machinery or to irrigate land. And the water wheel gives way to the steam engine and steam power. This gives way to eventually to electric power and so forth. At all times, of course, the changes, these technological changes, can be viewed as an economic process, excuse me, an economic process in which we're reflecting on ways in which we might do what we're doing better. So, technologically speaking, we're always improving in a sort of a linear process. We're engaging with nature in more effective and efficient ways. Of course, one might say we're exploiting nature ever more ruthlessly. Now, we humans also become, of course, skilled in using these technologies because these technologies are our own product. They're the product of our own reflection on our own material conditions. And so we become skilled in using these technologies. We become adapted ourselves to using them. And Marx calls this component of the mode of production, the technologies, the skills employed by us to use these technologies, the places in which we work, the machinery, and all the material equipment of society, one might say. He calls that the forces of production. So the forces of production are the tools, equipment, technologies, workplaces, technical skills we possess, and so forth. Well, those are the forces of production. The second component, so the mode of production is made up of two components. The second component in the mode of production is known as the relations of production. The relations of production are formed around the forces of production. So the forces of production dictate to us the pattern of the social relations of production. The relations of production represent the social form taken by the production mode. In other words, our economic activity organizes societies and structures humans into particular roles within the production processes of those societies. So it's the relations of production in society that produces qualitative changes. And it's the forces of production that causes the quantitative pressure on society, as referred to earlier. Now go to slide number 5, please. So the forces of production and relations of production form a dialectical relationship. Economic changes and technological progress put heat under society, heat as it were, under society and bring about societal change. Marx therefore sees in history distinctive changes in social formations. There are distinctive types of society that he identifies. Changes in our production methods brought about technological advances and new working practices. And those changes brought about wholesale changes in society in general. It took us out of a previous way of living and socialized us into a new way of living. Now, history reveals for Marx, and he says this in the German ideology, that human society passes through a variety of modes of production. Firstly, there was primitive communism, in which people reared animals, cultivated the land on the basis of small holdings, and by and large, this was a collective effort by very often an extended family or a closely integrated community, and the labour process was a collective effort. And what we mean by this is that there was no meaningful and identifiable division of labour, which would be to ascribe different types of activity to different people, as in the overall process of production. So there was no discernible division of labor in that everybody mucked in and did pretty much everything. And the tasks were family orientated, and so probably everybody did the same type of work. Division of labor is actually a feature of later societies, culminating in its most spectacular form in capitalist society. And the division of labor means, just to reiterate, different people have a different role in the overall production process. So everyone helps out in primitive communism with the daily tasks and the chores. But this, of course, this primitive communism belonged to a simple, backward, prehistoric period in history. Bronze Age sort of period. The next stage was the system of slavery that we find in ancient Greece. And here there was a sharp division of labor between the master and the slave, of course. The life and labor of one human being was significantly different from the other. And here it becomes apparent that the basis of the division of labor is actually ownership. One person apparently owns and commands the forces of production, and the other in the social relation doesn't. So the other is reduced to providing labor only and has no choice in this matter. So one human being, concludes Marx, exploits the other. Human exploitation. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles, he tells us in the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. And this is the key feature of all production modes, exploitation, but the nature of the exploitation, of course, that changes qualitatively from one historical epoch to the other. But it's a part of a larger transformation process. The whole of society is transformed by these economic changes. The next stage Marx talks about is the feudal era where serfs or peasants work the land, and the serfs or peasants pay rent to a landowner periodically. The landowner or aristocrat, as we might better understand him. Here, the exploitation was based on taking from the peasants a portion of their annual production. So the landlord made no specific labor contribution of his own necessarily beyond owning and controlling the mode of production. So his ownership again is very key to this. Hence, during the feudal period, there was a social arrangement here where two quite distinctive classes of people whose identity derived from the particular way that society produced. So the social identity becomes geared to the economic activity of that society. With peasants on the one side working on the land claimed to be owned by the aristocrat, therefore the aristocrat reaped part of the harvest simply to allow the peasant the privilege of working on the land to sustain their own existence. Now the next stage is capitalism, and of course this is the one that interests Marx. The capitalists, but the theme is the same. Ownership. The capitalist owns the mode of production, and the workers own nothing but their labor power. So that's the basis of the class relationship. The capitalist owns the forces of production, and the workers don't. So Marx calls this capitalist the bourgeoisie, and the workers he calls the proletariat, and they're two distinctive social identities founded in economics. So it's not class for Marx is not the way that a man thinks of himself. A man or a woman thinks of themselves as working class or bourgeois or middle class. It's not what you think. It's your class identity is a given. It is given to you by the way that society is structured. Involuntarily, you are simply born into your class in this regard. So we've got a concrete economic foundation here to social identity. This is the point. Now, several factors emerge from the capitalist economic explanation, the overall materialist explanation of history. Firstly, humans have produced in different ways. But they've never produced significantly without dividing society against itself through exploitation and ownership, having this contradiction within society based on who owns the mode of production and who supplies its labor. So opposing classes are, for Marx, established based on the way these classes relate to the production mode in any type of mode of production in history. Some own and control it, others are supplying its labor and thus exploited by it. So Marx is always seeing these modes of production through history as based on a relationship of exploitation. It's just that the character of exploitation changes. And of course, to go back to the point made about ideology at any stage will, of course, explain this exploitative relationship. Again, can we hear the echo of Rousseau here? So this means, secondly, that society forms classes with diametrically opposed interests. And so to go back to the point about a unity of distincts, what appears to be a unity is actually a unity of distinctive classes with diametrically opposed interests. So the class has got it's formed specifically according to an economic relationship, but its interests are diametrically different too. The class interests, or what would be in the interests of that person by virtue of their social identity, that's in conflict between classes. So, in other words, society is never at one with itself. It's always a fractured and incomplete unity, struggling from within itself. So, as your sociologist will tell you, Marx is what we would call a conflict theorist of society, a conflict theorist. Now, thirdly, what do we derive from this explanation of history? Humans have always moved to higher and more efficient forms of production. However, this has had negative consequences for humanity, for ever higher modes of production have been brought about by creating a worse quality of life. Well, you might say, well, working for a capitalist is not really equatable with slavery, is it? But when you think about the quality of life, or the slave, it was in the interest of the slave owner to look after the slave. The slave, after all, was his investment. And so the slave was likely cared for. Very often the slave would be part of the household. I mean, one wouldn't suggest for a second that it would be a pleasant existence to be a slave, but at least there was some sort of, one could say there's some sort of mutual interest between the slave owner and the slave, in which the life of the slave, the quality of life of the slave, would appeal to the interest somehow of the slave owner. The slave owner had an interest in preserving his investment. And when we come to the aristocrat landowner, very often the aristocrat landowner was benevolent to his peasants. I mean, after all, the peasants were, of course, the source of his wealth. And so, the peasants were left to get on with their humble existence. But, peasants were out in the fresh air working. They saw the rhythms of nature. They got plenty of sunshine on their faces. I mean, backbreaking labor, don't get me wrong about this. Again, I mean, not an easy life, but in some ways, it was, the feudal existence was quite wholesome. The peasants would be eating fresh vegetables and fruit and so forth, fresh food, home cooking, having to do everything for themselves. Existence was simple, but possibly quite wholesome. But capitalism, the capitalist age, was totally different. In many ways, it was ruthless in its treatment of workers. Workers were stripped, according to Marx, of their humanity and reduced to the level of machinery. For a start, we've lost the rhythms of nature of the feudal era. Now people are the ultimate command would be the clock. You start work at a certain time, and you go through the working day until you're released from your captivity, as it were, at the end of the day. And throughout your working day, you've got to produce as though you're a piece of machinery, basically. So even the feudal peasants would have had some greater control over their lives than these workers in the new capitalist conditions, working in factories which are noisy and very often dangerous and unhealthy places to work. But you really didn't have a lot of choice in it. You were commanded to go to work. So here then, of course, obviously Marx is able to exploit the idea of Hegel's idea of alienation. But alienation now is given completely different content. We're not somehow sensing our loss of some sort of God spirit. We are not wandering ghosts. Alienation now, for Marx, is embedded in the production process itself. Humans, he says, are a labouring species. Marx makes this quite clear. We are a labouring species. We're designed for it. We gain, and therefore, if that's the case, we gain a sense of ourselves as human beings through our economic activity, through our work. We get a sense of who we are. It is sort of work fulfills, or it ought to fulfill, our humanity. So, work would give rise to an opportunity for us to exhibit and exploit our creative faculties, to express our characters, to express our feelings, perhaps. And so, work would be an expression, an artistic expression, if for want of another way of putting it, an artistic expression that we're creating something that hasn't previously existed. But with capitalism, the problem is we have employed a production mode here that effectively dehumanizes us. So we'll look into this in more detail next week. But what Marx is arguing here is that if we affirm our humanity in our work, then we ought to expect our work to be the source of cooperation. It ought to be the source of an outlet for our creative powers. And this ought to be a source of satisfaction to us, a source of self-fulfillment. We ought to be leaping out of bed in the morning saying we're going to work thinking, yippee, today I can be human. But in actual fact, we go off to work considering our lives to be one of endless compulsion towards an existence of pure drudgery, in which we go to work on a Monday and we can't wait from that moment we arrive at work for Friday evening, when for 2 measly days we are free. But of course, back in Marx's time, production would have gone on for 6 days, and in fact the right to go to pray on the Sabbath, the seventh day, was something that had to be won by trade unions. Work should make us happy, but in actual fact, it's the cause of our alienation. Something actually that, as mentioned earlier, religion comes in to kind of assuage within us and pacify us and sort of kill the pain, our alienation. But the cause of alienation, Marx has now identified quite firmly in the production process. So whilst work ought to make us happy, it's not the case, particularly under capitalism. Work actually is the source of our alienation now. And we'll look at what we mean by alienation in more detail. But we're talking about alienation now in terms of alienation as being sort of self-estranged from ourselves. We are not wholly human, and we get that feeling that there's something completely wrong and missing about our lives. But also, alienation takes into consideration that we are not fully human, in that it's sort of encouraging us, it's encouraging separations and divisions between us as human beings. So this is what capitalism's done. Now, this is as far as I want to go this week, and I think I've supplied plenty of information to go on with. Next week, so we've looked at when we come to the 3 component parts of Marxism, we've looked at in some detail at the philosophical component. We'll come next week to consider Marx's economic theories and his political theories. So for now, at least, I'll sign off. So thanks for your attention. And we'll have our Zoom meeting very shortly. Bye-bye.